So if you have a really inflamed gut, your immune cells are going to get trained to operate in a really inflamed way. And then you have a higher likelihood of developing something like autoimmune, where your immune system's just overreactive.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Food Matters podcast, your home for nutrition, health, and wellness education. My name is Laurentine. I am a filmmaker and a nutritionist and the founder of foodmatters.com, and I'm here to hold your hand on this journey to optimum health, transformation, and emotional healing. Hello, Food Matters fans, family, and audience. It is so exciting to be here in the studio again. And we're here again with Dr. Christine Smith. So Dr. Christine Smith is back with us again for another amazing interview. And you may remember her from the masterclass series that we did before. We loved her interview so much that we wanted to get her back. And Dr. Christine has focused her work on seeing the whole person through personalized integrative healthcare as a functional medicine practitioner and doctor of chiropractic. With a background in cognitive neuroscience, she specializes in chronic inflammation prevention, optimization, and cellular injury recovery. Dr. Christine is passionate about how to achieve the mental, chemical, physical body balance for holistic healing. Hey girl, how's it going?
Hello, it's so good to see you and to be back. Thank you for having me.
Yes, well, I really enjoyed our interview last time, and I wanted to make sure that we get the most of your wisdom out of you. Sorry, that may sound a little bit funny, but you have so much information to share. We really just wanted to make sure that we really get to the bottom of your core essence of teachings. So, Christine, today I wanted to continue on the topic of inflammation. And I would love you to address what are the typical inflammation markers and what can we do about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on what you're looking at. There's a lot of them. In blood work, it can be things like looking at, CRP, and that is a marker that just kind of lets us know, like, if there's inflammation in the cardiovascular system as well as other places. But I also look at it with other non-classic markers, like CRP and ESR are some of the classic markers for just like basic inflammation in the body. I also look at it as like cholesterol. Like if your cholesterol is really high, it means that your body's trying to repair something. So instead of just lowering cholesterol, my question is, well, what is your body trying to repair and why is it high? And that to me is a significantly more important thing to look into. And, another thing is, if hemoglobin A1C is high, which people pretty much only think about with blood sugar, which it is the standard marker for over like blood sugar over duration of time, but it can also represent toxic burden on the body and oxidative stress. And I think that's one that people forget about. So if you have like a really reasonable fasting insulin or glucose, and then your hemoglobin A1C is high, you might want to be looking for if you've had a chemical exposure or a toxin exposure or something of those means. And to me, all of those represent inflammation. Some other classic markers would be like iron and ferritin. Like our body tends to have high iron levels when we're dealing with inflammation, and we will retain iron when we're dealing with an infection because it starves the infection. So high iron levels are kind of another thing I look at. It's usually like an acute inflammation marker. Things like uric acid are another one. That's the thing that's usually involved in gout. And it just means that your body's having a hard time processing amino acids correctly. And it can indicate a lot of different things. So, all of these are kind of somewhat non-specific, but they are your check engine light. They're the indicator that like something's off. And then I also like looking at blood work, like the complete blood count and seeing what white blood cells are doing and red blood cells are doing. And, if they're elevated and like if neutrophils are elevated, it might mean you have a bacterial infection. If they're low, it might mean that you've had one for a long time. Versus if, certain lymphocytes are elevated, you could be dealing with something viral, and that might be just like a classic cold and something passive or, that doesn't take very long. Or it could be something like you've had Epstein-Barr that lives in your cells reactivated. And I'll see this a lot in like chronic illness patients where it seems like they've gotten hit with all the things. And then all of a sudden, like they have a viral load in their body too. And it's just because their immune system is overwhelmed. So all of those things can indicate inflammation. And then you can go into, classic inflammatory markers like interleukin 6 and stuff like that, or TNF alpha, NF kappa beta, but not everybody tests for those. The other ones I listed are like what you'll see on a classic blood lab. So those are good places to start. But to me, really if any of the systems are off, it's often an indicator that, the body's working on something, the immune system is working on something, which usually means inflammation is present somewhere, even if the CRP isn't high. So just if they are high, it's a definite, like, yes, there's inflammation. If they aren't high, it's not necessarily a definite no.
Okay, so that's beautiful, Christine. So when a patient comes to you with indicators of inflammation, and like you said, there's a vast variety of different ways that can show up. Do you walk with them through all the blood results and then have enough time to be able to explain to them how they can handle perhaps a change of diet or a change of lifestyle? Do you have enough time to sit down with them and to be able to guide them through a new way of living?
I have changed the duration of my appointment times to allow that to happen, which is why I choose to work privately, because you can't have those conversations in a 10-minute appointment. It just doesn't work. And I've also created online courses for clients just to help them do things that we can't always do in the office. Like I take them on a tour through the grocery store and show them how to read labels and like considerations for shopping. Like I teach people how to perimeter shop, which is just like, don't go down the aisles that don't contain food and just make that your grocery shopping, and simple tips like that. In our appointments, my intake is minimum about 80 minutes. I find I often go over. Sometimes I can do it in 60, depending on the complexity of the case. But for like a really complex case, I like 80 minutes. Just because it's really hard to fit someone's life story into a box, especially when they've had a crazy amount of stuff happen. And to me, that's really the only way to do care and create a customized plan, is to understand someone's, like, really their full life history. I have questions on my intake form about, birth history and like, what was your birth like? Because to me, if you had a traumatic birth, it can mean a variety of different things for your system. Or if you were a C-section baby, it means you didn't get inoculated with your mother's microbiome and you have a tendency to have conditions more like asthma and autoimmune because your microbiome isn't the same as someone who went through the vaginal canal during birth. So understanding like the full story of someone and sitting there in presence and letting them tell you that story and allowing them to be seen and heard, I think is actually a really big part of the healing process. And I think it's something that's missing in the conventional model, is like you can't feel seen in those 10-minute appointments. You feel like a number. And I think having someone create that space for you creates a biochemical shift in your body by itself. So we'll spend time talking about their history. I'll look at old lab work. I'll look at trends that have happened over time and like what tendencies their body has. So even if someone has lab work from, 6 years ago, like I still glance at it because it'll tell me how their body tends to respond to things, especially if I know what was happening in their life at that time. I'm like, oh, like you have a tendency for your cholesterol to go up when you're dealing with stress because you were getting divorced at the time your cholesterol was super high. And it just tells me about their body. And you can start to make guesses about someone's genetics based on like how they present, which genetics I take with a grain of salt because they're really just blueprints. It's not necessarily saying that you're doomed to that or that it's your destiny or that there's no other option. It's more like, oh, this is your body's blueprint, and let me look at what pieces of it are being activated or what tendencies you have. So, if someone has a lifetime history of being just sensitive to chemicals and chemistry, and they have like they can smell someone's perfume and it bothers them, tells me that they might not have like the best detox genetics compared to somebody else, which means like for that person, it might be more important for me to run a tox screen than for someone that doesn't have those conditions or symptoms. And so it's just really looking at a full intake to look at things from a bunch of different angles, because it's rarely one thing that causes disease. It's like an accumulation of things and different parts of the body that are stressed and need support. And then my approach, or the functional medicine approach, is essentially like, okay, well, let's trust the intelligence of the body. How can we support the systems that are under duress so that they can operate properly and bring your body back to a state of balance? Because that's what it's designed to do. That's homeostasis. So that's why I think the intake is so important. And I think taking a history well is a bit of an art. and something that you learn over time, because you have to start learning to ask weird questions. Like, I had someone with repetitive like neck and shoulder pain, and we worked on it so many times and it wouldn't go away. And then finally in our conversation, because we were talking about work, it came out that he'd been reaching over his middle console and grabbing his backpack from the back seat every day, multiple times a day. I was like, oh, well, that would be why you have tendonitis in your neck. And we figured it out, and now he's better. And it's just like learning how to ask questions about somebody's life that allows you to understand where things are coming from. Or like someone with a low back thing who also had a knee injury, and no one had asked her how she'd been going down the stairs. And she was going down the stairs sideways, sidestepping on the same side for like a year, and it caused her a back issue, but she was doing it to protect her knee. And no one would think twice about that. So I just told her to go down the stairs backwards. And now she goes down backwards evenly, and it doesn't bother her knee, and it protects her back. And those are just, physical ailments. But even for, like, I'm working with a client who has been dealing with a lot of hypersensitivities, and we're doing some tracking over time. And it turned out that she had a mold exposure. And we figured out where it came from because her dog had symptoms too. And her dog basically got like an autoimmune condition and got like a bunch of sinus stuff when they were living in this house that had mold in it. And so did she. And so then we figured out we needed, because when she told me like the dog was having symptoms too, I was like, oh, we need to look for mycotoxins and like some kind of environmental exposure that was affecting multiple creatures in the home. And we found a bunch of mycotoxins. So it's those kinds of questions and asking weird things that is something that I think is so important in that first appointment that you can't do if it's short.
I am so happy that you say that. And I love that the point of view of where you're coming from is you're right. Like, we can't diagnose and heal people in the first 10 minutes. And there's no way that we can figure out what's going on in someone's life and their journey in 10 minutes. And unfortunately, I mean, the medical system is set up around GPs visits.
They're not even going to be able to be vulnerable enough to open up and tell you what's really going on in those 10 minutes.
Exactly. And I feel like there's not necessarily a lack of information, because we have access to incredible amounts of information these days, but there's a lack of somebody that is actually taking the responsibility to look at this person, listen to their history, and look at how they can help this person on their journey. And we're seeing a lot more patients coming in now with chronic fatigue, and different types of autoimmune conditions, chronic pain and inflammation. And there's no one size fits all for that. There's no one pill that can fix all of those things. So it really requires almost like a psychological and medical assessment, and to understand more about, like you said, the past and how they were born and what sort of situation their family is in right now. So it's beautiful that you're saying that you're able to give this to patients, because I feel that that's really where the medical profession should be heading towards. So in regards to people coming in with chronic pain, and we're starting to see a lot more of this, I would like you to touch a little bit on the power of actually physically touching, because so often I've heard that in the medical profession, the touch, the sense of touch is not really used. Whereas in the chiropractic care, it's actually allowed. You're allowed to work with people and work and almost heal people in that way with the sense of touch. So could you explain a little bit more about how you use touch in your practice and how important it is for patients?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was actually one of the reasons I chose to not go to medical school and chose to go to chiropractic school instead. Because in my younger years, the thing that got me out of research and into wanting to understand the mind-body connection was my own experience of dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety, and the conventional system trying to use pharmaceuticals to help, and things not going the way they were planned, and my body not having a great reaction to it. And I ended up going to basically a neurological physical therapist that did a touch-based technique on my system. And in like 3 appointments, my anxiety was gone and I didn't have any more panic attacks. And I was like, what did you do to me? And I dove into understanding cognitive neuroscience and the connection between the brain and the body. And I wanted to be able to do that technique. So it was important to me to be not only allowed to touch my patients, but taught how to touch them. And again, if you have a 10-minute appointment, you can't do stuff like that. And Chiropractic, I also loved because it's based on vitalism. It's based on vitalism, or like vitalistic medicine, which is essentially trusting the innate intelligence of the body and finding ways to bring it out instead of inhibit it, which I resonate more with that model. And through touch, we do a lot of different things. Like you look at animals in the animal kingdom, and there's grooming, and like grooming is a bonding thing. It delivers oxytocin. It helps you feel connected and safe. It creates that sense of safety in your body, and the sense of safety, I think, is one of the most important things, um, because that is what turns on your parasympathetic nervous system, which then results in producing neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, which can actually be calming to your fight or flight system, which is what tends to activate, epinephrine and cortisol, which can be part of the inflammatory pathway. So just through touch alone, you can actually start downregulating inflammation, because a lot of people don't realize, but your immune cells actually have receptors for oxytocin. So when you are hugging someone or you're being touched in a way that makes you feel safe and the oxytocin is released, it's actually downregulating to some of your immune cells and your cytokines and your inflammatory messengers. So just through those things, like touch alone, you're balancing body chemistry. And then when you blend touch with actually helping take physical stress off the body, physical strain off the body, because, if something's out of alignment, it's like driving with your car out of alignment. It's just going to wear on the car in a really weird way. You can do it. It's not going to last you a long time. And, in the previous historic days, humans didn't really live past 30. Now we do. And so it's that much more important to get that car aligned so that you can drive it for 90 years. And if we take the physical stress off the body and we have the chemical induction of a safe state, and with physical touch, we often store emotions in our tissues. There's that joke, the issue is in the tissue. And when you start to release the stress of those tissues and you release where people are holding a strain, it can also release emotion and help them actually process something again. And that's one of the ideas of chiropractic. There's something called the potential energy theory, where it's like you have potential energy that gets stored in your body after certain experiences. And when you are able to release it, it gets released into the system again for a second opportunity to be processed. And so that's why sometimes you can get body work and you'll start crying during your body work and you have no idea why. And it's because you've been holding on to this in your system and you're finally in a state where your nervous system feels safe enough to release it. And that release is also a huge chemical release, which means that you're not storing that chemistry in your tissues anymore, which if you just repress all of your emotions and repress anger for 20 years can turn into cells that don't operate correctly. And then that can lead to a variety of diagnoses. And there's even with autoimmune stuff, there's a super interesting book about repressed emotions and how they show up in different autoimmune cases by Dr. Gabor Mate called When the Body Says No. And it's pretty fascinating because he talks about what personality types get different autoimmune conditions. And it's just, there's a lot of different trends in that realm. And, even people like Louise Hay, who is another really well-known person in the mind body world. She has a whole book called Heal Your Body. And that book lists how different body parts can be associated with different emotions, and different conditions can be associated with different emotions. Like skin is often about how you present yourself to the world, and knees and legs often have to do with driving forward in your life, and wrists and hands can be about overgiving. So there's a lot of emotional stuff tied in with all the physical care as well. So to me, it's none of it is really separate, and it's just about what part of your overall load is overstrained. Is it your physical body? Is it your emotional, mental body, or is it your chemical body? And which one needs support first and primarily so that the other ones can fall back into balance too.
I love that. And just so that we're clear for the audience as well. So when we're talking about touch, I mean, what sort of experience would you like to give an example of what you would mean? I would imagine if I was sitting with my GP on my consultation and all of a sudden he came over and gave me a hug, I'd be like, that's going to creep me out. But in regards to, I mean, if it was you, I would love it. I would be like, thank you so much. I really needed that. But in regards to like healing and the touch that you were talking about, what can we imagine that, you're able to offer for people in that way?
Sure. So there's a variety of different ways that you can approach it. Me as a practitioner, I hug my clients. I think it's important. Not every one of them, right? Like I read them. It's like, is this something that would make you feel safe or uncomfortable? Because that's the whole point, is to make you feel safe. So I think as a practitioner, it's a huge part of your duty to watch people's subtle cues and read their energy and have your attention very outwardly focused so that you can see how they're responding to you as you're talking to them. Because like I like conventional medicine and it absolutely has its place, but one of my issues with it that I find more often than not is how practitioners speak to their patients. I went to a neurological consult with a patient today just because he wanted support, and he's having some cognitive decline and he needed just kind of like an accountability buddy. And I just went to kind of listen to what was being said. And the neurologist was very good. They were addressing everything that needed to be addressed. And then he started going into like, well, here's all the different boxes that you might fit into that are essentially neurodegenerative diseases that aren't curable. But I have no idea if you fit into any of them yet. We have to run a bunch more tests. I get it. But to me, I'm like, okay, what was the point of that? You just completely stressed out the patient for something that's not even necessarily tangible yet. And now that patient's going to be focused on that in a stressful way until we get data, which is like months out. So to me, it makes more sense to talk to the patient of like, well, there are these things that might happen, but really, like, we just want to focus on these, and you've been improving for the last week. So let's put our attention there. And then these are our next steps and what we're going to look at next. And you can just leave it that simply. Or, people say like, well, your illness or your disease, and they just start putting these words out that make you have a relationship with your body, that make you feel like something is broken and wrong, versus like, this phase and these symptoms that you're currently dealing with, meaning like it's transient. And you give this body the subtle cue that it can be transient rather than like your disease. So I think wording and the way you speak to yourself and the way practitioners speak to you is really important. And just even like if a practitioner is delivering news or you see someone tearing up, like if I'm sitting across from someone with my computer and I see them having an emotional moment, I set my computer down and I move closer to them. Sometimes I'll touch their knee if it feels right or whatever, but you can touch someone just with your energy and with your presence and just with an action, like putting a computer down and really looking someone in the eye. But then when it comes to treatment, things like massage, things like chiropractic, things like acupuncture, craniosacral, like anything where your practitioner is actually touching you and working on your body to stimulate your nervous system, because that's really one of the reasons it's so beneficial. Is our fastest neuronal pathways are our touch pathways. It will override your pain pathway any day. So I use touch all the time for chronic pain. It's like when you bust your shin on something and you rub it to make it feel better. That's the pain gate mechanism. It's touch overriding pain. And so if you can do these body work techniques, it helps the body feel safe. It starts to change the chemistry and you're like overriding pain pathways, but it's also doing it in a way that's safe, in a way that's matching the tone of the body and not overpowering it, which is why I wanted to go to chiropractic school, because that's where you learn the art of touch. Like anybody can touch people, but touching someone and like listening with your hands and being able to feel how their tissue's responding and not overpower it and like wait for this invitation in, I think that's what makes the difference between really good body workers and body workers that just kind of go through the motions. Is like, you have to listen to how the body's responding, and not everybody's like, if I'm about to adjust somebody's neck, because I think this is one of the things that gets people really freaked out about chiropractors, right? It's like the cracking. If I go to touch somebody's neck and they're tense with what I'm doing, I don't continue what I'm doing. I'm not going to do an adjustment and power through someone's protective, guarded muscular response, because that basically sends a huge signal in a danger state. Instead, I'm going to wait until their body feels safe and invites me in, so that a big signal is sent in a safety state, which is a completely different chemical response in the body. And if I can't get them to that safe state, I'm not going to do what I was about to do. I'm going to shift what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a tool. I'm going to do something different. So I have many different ways of working on people based on how their body's responding, because that is what gives the proper chemical response. And you have to be able to listen to that and identify it as a practitioner. But touch in general, like any of those touch-based techniques, just having another human be unconditionally present for you and providing physical stimulation in a safe, unpredicted way allows our body to actually go into like an alpha brainwave state, because you're getting all this sensation in and your amygdala, your fear center, is analyzing it and processing it. But if it's done in a safe way, you basically start to reprogram the fear center of the brain to the point where you have a healthy neurological output response, which then changes chemistry. So there was a very nerdy answer to your question.
You sound like such a beautiful healer. Thank you so much for that answer. And it goes back to something that I personally do as well in the way that I parent. I remember reading the Ayurvedic text when baby is born. They, like the Indian community, they like to actually, help that baby, to massage it and to really feel that it comes into its body. And obviously this baby's been stuck in the belly for so long. All of a sudden, it's out of this out of the womb, and then they have this sensory feeling, right? So being able to touch a baby is really important. And I remember doing that to our kids for so long, and having that sense of touch as a beautiful tool to calm them down, even before bed, and listening to their stories of the day, and just being able to give them a gentle massage and allow them to go into that state of slumber. And touch is just not used enough in our society. It's almost frowned upon. It's almost, we are very cold. We are, especially after COVID, we were very standoffish as a population. And I remember reading a book just recently, dear Teal Swan, she wrote a book on how we are chronically lonely. Like, we're as a population become chronically lonely, and we're not touching each other enough, and we're not communicating enough, and we're not looking at each other's eyes enough. So it's beautiful that you can address that through chiropractic care, and that people can actually come to you and feel safe.
Absolutely. And it's such a nice option to have if you don't have the relationships in your life that allow for that. Like, let's say you're a widow or something, or a widower, or an orphan. Like I've had a patient who was an orphan, and her nervous system was very different because she grew up in a really different environment where a safe environment and loving touch-based environment was not available to her. So her nervous system operates on high drive. And after our appointments was one of the only times that she could really sleep. But it took a long time for her to feel safe at our appointment. So it was like a very slow progression. But I think, for anyone who doesn't have that readily available in their life, it's even more important to have just a body worker that you work with of whatever kind is right for you. But, preferably something where you leave feeling like you're in a different nervous system state, which, I'm kind of a different type of chiropractor. I see people for about an hour, but I do a lot of different things. I'll do soft tissue work. I'll do dry needling. I do my chiropractic work. I'll do craniosacral work. Sometimes I do like a trauma release based technique, which is that touch one I talked about earlier. And it just depends on what people come in with. And we don't do the same thing every time. So, if you have tried a certain modality before and you're like, oh, this isn't for me, or I didn't like that, try a different practitioner. Like, go practitioner shopping and wait until you find someone that you really resonate with, and then make that the thing you do regularly. And then you can see different ones. You can rotate. I refer my patients out for Rolfing because it's a really great thing, and it's not something I've been fully trained in. So I refer people for other things and to other practitioners. I collaborate with PTs and other body workers. And I think it's important as a practitioner to have a really good referral network. And it shocks me sometimes in like medical settings how they don't have a referral. Like the neurological patient I was with today, we asked his neurologist for a new functional medicine cardiologist referral, and he didn't have any. And so I went and I found some for that patient, but it surprised me that he didn't have any referrals. And I think as a practitioner, it's important to have a good network like that.
Let's talk about gut issues. A lot of people are coming in with gut issues and they're not necessarily sure where that is going to, how they can help themselves. And then they come to a person like yourself. And what would be the biggest thing that you help people with in regards to their healing journey for gut issues?
Yeah. So I think the gut is one of the most overlooked things in pretty much all conditions because it is a second brain. It is called our enteric nervous system, has as many neurons as a cat's brain, sends more signals back to your brain than your brain sends to your gut. And there's also something called retrograde transport of molecules from your gut to your brain through the vagus nerve, meaning molecules go backwards from your gut up to your brain. So there's a lot of new articles around Parkinson's being related to some of that retrograde transport of faulty molecules from the gut. And that can be, a microbiome that's really disrupted. And there's also stuff called Peyer's patches, which is like immune tissue in the gut. And it's where a lot of our immune cells will go to essentially learn how to operate and get, further training. So if you have a really inflamed gut, your immune cells are going to get trained to operate in a really inflamed way. And then you have a higher likelihood of developing something like autoimmune, where your immune system's just overreactive, or mast cell activation syndrome, which I feel like has been increasing rampantly recently for people. And ironically is highly tied to emotional stress. So if you have someone with mast cell activation syndrome that's just not getting better and is allergic to everything, numero uno, they need to work on their stress response, and probably through something like meditation and getting their body back to a place of feeling safe. A lot of the time, what I'll find in mast cell activation syndrome is a sense of betrayal, whether it's by self, others, or the universe. And this sense of like, you can't trust anything anymore. And it's a common thing I see, the mast cell activation syndrome. So when you have like a really strong histamine response to something, or a lot of skin issues, or a lot of allergies, or a lot of food intolerances, that is usually something that I see come up with that. And, that can come up with a lot of different emotions. But essentially, when you have a big emotional stressor, betrayal just happens to be like a really big one for anybody, right? But really, any kind of intense emotional stress can lead to an inflammatory response, much like breaking your leg. So you can have an emotional injury. And that's essentially why my niche is holistic injury recovery, is because I retrain people on what they perceive as an injury. You can have a chemical injury, like a mold exposure. You can have a physical injury, like breaking your leg or a car accident. Or you can have an emotional injury, like losing your home, or going through a divorce, or going through a worldwide pandemic that's super stressful and nobody knows what's going on. That's an emotional injury of sorts. People react differently to them. Some people, it's not as stressful, whereas other people can develop PTSD. And depending on the severity of your perception of it and your reaction to it, correlates to the level of inflammation that arises in your body. And what happens in that acute inflammation stage, that initial stage, which is good, right? It's our body doing what it's supposed to. It's trying to protect us, because, you can be stressed out about the fact that you just got fired, but your body's responding to it like there's a tiger chasing you currently. Your body goes into a state where your tissues become more porous, and that way your immune cells can travel through them to do their job. But that means that you essentially have leakiness throughout the majority of your tissues. This includes your gut. So if you are now in a immune state because your brain is stressed and your brain is telling your immune system to be on the defense, your immune system goes into a defensive state. This is called a cell danger response. Your cells also change, like the membranes actually kind of stiffen up in like a protective response because the chemistry is shifting. So then your cells don't operate the same, and you're not going to be in a state to absorb nutrients. And now you also have particles kind of leaking through the gut. And this is supposed to be like, a very short sprint where you're like running from the tiger up a tree. But now it's like weeks and months and years for people in this state. And then you start to get these things leaking through your gut, whether that's food particles or debris from bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria have something called LPS, lipopolysaccharides, which is like a little signal molecule on their surface. And if that leaks through, our immune response to that is pretty intense, and you can have some brain inflammation from that. And, these things don't always show up as gut issues. Like, people think that it shows up as, bloating and diarrhea and constipation. Not always. It can totally show up as a brain issue. Like, so things that I will say that can often indicate something's going on with your gut and inflammation is like just an overall feeling of feeling dense and heavy and feeling puffy and thick. Or if you are having an autoimmune disorder or really weird weight gain or weight that you can't get rid of, and then the digestive symptoms, constipation, diarrhea, reflux, feeling like you have that, that frog in your throat, or like feeling like you have an itchy tongue or an itchy throat. That can be part of the histamine response. And then in the brain, it can show up as like irritability and depression and anxiety and brain fog and blurry vision and headaches and migraines, and can show up as fatigue and flushing of the skin or acne or getting a rash, itchiness on the palms or the bottoms of the feet, or swelling, like even just subtle swelling around your eyelids. Like when you wake up and you have those puffy eyes and they're kind of all droopy, that means that you might want to like check in with what you did over the last day or two. And, what did you eat? Did you have a immune response? If you're like, I ate perfectly, I don't understand. Look at your stress response. You're like, oh, I did have that really stressful meeting at work. Okay, like that might be it. And then, it can go into joint pain and arthritis or just like allergies. And there's a whole bunch of peer-reviewed research tying asthma and gut health together, because it's essentially your immune system responding incorrectly because your gut biome is not training it correctly. There's even like a really good little cartoon from NPR, just like National Public Radio. And it's like a 5-minute cartoon you can use to explain to kids of like how your immune system and your gut are related. And so if we start to get this leaky gut and we have food particles leaking through, and now we have bacteria particles leaking through, and then our immune system is on high alert and it's distracted by all this stuff. And then all of a sudden it can't take care of like, the cut that we get. And then we get a little bit more bacteria from like a paper cut. And then our system just starts getting overwhelmed with like all of these pieces it's trying to control, simply because we're dealing with gut permeability and stuff that's supposed to stay contained isn't contained anymore. It's leaking into our bloodstream. And then that creates what's called a subclinical level of endotoxemia, meaning inwardly produced toxins. So you're accidentally poisoning your own blood. And I think this is where we start to get fatigue and brain fog and memory issues and just not feeling like yourself or feeling grumpy or just not having emotional resiliency can be another really big piece of it. Or if you're like really not getting good sleep all the time, sleep is how we repair. So if you're blending all of these together and then you're also pounding the coffee and you're really stressed out, that's like a recipe for you might have some health issues in 5 to 10 years. And so I think teaching people this now is why it's so important, is because if you can understand like, oh, I had pizza and beer last night and I'm really puffy today, I should probably focus on some protein and veggies for like the next 4 days until I'm not puffy anymore. And then I can consider having another beer. And that's how you live your life and enjoy yourself and enjoy your holidays and stuff with your family. But you do it in a sustainable way where you're not tanking your health by doing too much back to back all the time. Like you just have to give your body some breaks to catch up and clean up all the debris so that your immune system and your cellular functions can operate correctly.
Beautifully said. Beautiful. And so for patients that are coming into your office, and especially with gut issues, with leaky gut and gut dysbiosis, any type of dysfunction in the gut, what would be your first method of healing, besides what you've just mentioned and all the beautiful explanations that you've given on the reasons why this is happening? But what would be the first thing that you would address with these patients?
Yeah, it would depend on the client, which is always my answer, right? My answer is always, it depends, because everybody's different. If I get someone who has a ton of food sensitivities and is really sensitive to a whole bunch of things, and they sit there and they tell me their entire medical history with a pretty straight face, where they're not that emotional and they're very businesslike about it, I know that person is pretty disconnected from their body and their nervous system. So we'll actually start with body work, because if I just throw a bunch of supplements at them, their body's going to reject it anyway. And, I'll usually have them stick to whatever foods they're able to do. But then I really like to run a food sensitivity test with that person, because to me, there's a lot of tests that you can run that are, expensive, where you can figure out, exactly what inflammation marker there is, or, what autoimmune marker there is. My question is always the same. What are you going to do about it? It's like, you can know what autoimmune markers are high, but I want the actionable thing. And the actionable thing is how to remove the inflammation and then how to heal the tissues. So the first thing you can do on how to heal the inflammation is a food sensitivity test. And it's a pretty simple thing to run. They tend to be decently inexpensive. They're not totally accurate and they change over time, but it'll give you an inkling of like what things are, really not great for someone. Most common things I see are gluten, dairy, corn, eggs, soy, genetically modified stuff. I've even seen more sensitivities to salmon coming up because there's so much genetically modified and farmed salmon, and farmed fish that's fed really terrible stuff is actually like a carcinogen now. So you have to be really careful with your meat selection. But I'll start there. If someone's really sensitive, it's like, okay, well, like what can we take out that is going to just stop lighting fires in the first place? And I think stopping lighting fires is step number one. That can look different for different people. I have another guy who has ulcerative colitis, and he can't do veggies. Like it just pisses his system off, even though we are taught that, vegetables are good. They feed our microbiome. His system cannot handle the roughage. So for him, he's doing the carnivore diet, and that works for him right now. And it's nutritionally dense. He gets what he needs. We're working into being able to do other things, but he came to me really, really inflamed. So that's where we're starting with him. In general, if someone's, not so intense and not so sensitive, and they're just kind of dealing with like, let's say bloating, right? That's a really common one. My first question would be, like, where's your bloating? Is it up high or is it down low? It tells me if it's in the small intestine or the large intestine, and that changes how we approach things. But, most common is in the small intestine because that's usually SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And I'll ask them, and this is where the history stuff comes in, right? Like I ask, my intake form is very detailed. Ask them, like, I don't want to go over what they're eating for breakfast. I want them to write that down. And then I can ask questions of like, when you eat this, does this happen? And that's like, those are the history questions. And so, if someone's getting bloated within like half hour after eating, it lets me know that they have SIBO that's, fairly high in the small intestine. And with that, then we look at like a FODMAP diet, which is, again, stuff you'd normally consider healthy, garlic, onions, all that kind of stuff that would normally feed your microbiome. For them, because they have an overgrowth, we don't want to feed the microbiome. So for them, something like carnivore or keto can actually be better because it starts to not to overfeed the microbiome while we maybe work with some antimicrobials, depending on their status. And then we can also work with, fiber and binders to kind of pull out some of the excess that's there. And I think using binders is something practitioners miss a lot whenever they're doing detox stuff. And I think it's pretty important because you can, use like an antifungal or antimicrobial, and then their system and their liver can get totally overwhelmed trying to handle the debris. And so I think using binders during that time is important. And then at the same time, I still like to work on food sensitivities for those people. And I think it's really important to work on the gut lining because you can remove all the food sensitivities, but if you don't heal the gut lining, they're just going to develop new ones of whatever food they shift to. And ironically, it's usually the food that the person is eating the most. They're like, I eat that all the time. I have a sensitivity to it. That's why they've just had more opportunities to be exposed to it while they have this leakiness in their gut. So, a really simple thing people can do at home is just bone broth. It has glutamine, it has B vitamins, it's nutritionally dense, it has minerals. You can put veggies in there to get like, the secretions of the veggies. So it's a really nutrient dense thing that has collagen and all the other things that your gut needs to heal. And, you can just drink it straight. You can cook rice in it. You can use it to simmer veggies. Like I use it all the time in my cooking. I usually have bone broth around, and it's like you throw it in a crock pot and you ignore it for 10 to 20 hours. It's super easy. And so it's a very easy thing to make at home. And that's just like a classic food thing that you can do. But aloe is another one that's really healing for the gut and actually can recycle your glutathione as well. And then depending on what's going on with the person, like if they're dealing with gut issues and they've had a toxin exposure, that person I'm definitely going to use binders with because the toxin exposure is part of the inflammation that's making them leaky too. It's not always just the food. So that's where the complexity of cases changes the approach. Like it can't really be the same for everybody, but conceptually, the way that I, really like to think about it is we kind of have to start with your mind and like what signals are you sending to your body? Like we have to fix your brain first and what you want your body to do. So it's more like the subconscious thing of working from a state of like, body, I am so grateful that you're healing so rapidly. And I love that I can sit here and watch in my mind's eye you healing the membranes and the cellular lining of my gut. And you like sit there and you imagine your body healing it, and you just like watch it get stitched up. And those are like meditations that you can play with, where you are visually and intentionally and energetically sending instructions to your body of what you want it to do. Your body's pretty incredible if you send it instructions. It's just people forget to do that. They forget to intentionally put in an instruction with their body. And this is the idea of self-care. Self-care can come in a lot of different forms, but it's the idea of intentionally taking a break from your life and going inward and having a good relationship with your body in a state where you feel safe and grateful and positive. And it's like those emotions chemically change your system. And then it's getting your lifestyle in line. Like if you're not sleeping and you're not eating, you're not drinking water, you're really not going to be able to heal from conditions. So we just got to get like the fundamentals down. And then we start to work on energy, like cellular energy. It's hard for your body to heal if you don't have the cellular energy to do it. So like what's going on with your mitochondria? And then I like to work on the gut. And then we can work on the immune system, because the immune system is going to be out of whack until the gut's repaired. And then I'll work on metabolic stuff. And then I'll work on detox stuff, because you can't detox if your gut's not working. Like if you're constipated and you try to detox, you're just dumping toxins back into your system and they're going right back into your blood. So it's pointless, and you can actually damage tissues if you do detox too fast, too early. So you have to get the system moving, and then you can do those other steps. And then I'll go to hormones. Like, and there's different, schools of thought. And if someone's hormones are really off, like, yes, you need hormones to heal as well. But I find hormones are signals. And if you correct the other things in the body, they often self-regulate. But it's just about how you like to approach things. And that's a generalization, but yeah, again, it just depends on the person. And then for someone who's just, maybe dealing with a little bit of brain fog, but they don't really have bloating, but they have a lot of cravings for sugar and some acne and maybe some yeast infections, that person, I'm going to be wondering more about Candida. And, for them, I'd be like, okay, like no sugar, no alcohol for you, low carbs. And let's just see if you feel better after 2 to 3 weeks from doing that. Most of the time they do. And then you can work with competitive probiotics, like things like Floromyces, which is competitive to Candida. And you can just start having the good guys kind of nudge out the bad guys. But practitioners have to remember that probiotics are technically inflammatory instigators. So my ulcerative colitis guy cannot handle probiotics. Like it's just his system can't do it. So we're not even there yet. And probiotics usually come later, or, if someone's pretty healthy, then you can use them. But if someone's super sensitive, it's probably not the right first step. And if you give someone probiotics and they have like a ton of diarrhea, like slow down, and you need to work on the gut lining a little bit, and you need to slowly introduce it and like just rotate, go slower. And, but if they're just dealing with that, then usually with like some probiotics, some binders, and some gut healing, like gut lining support, that person's going to feel better in a couple weeks if they just kind of shift their diet a little bit and do a couple of those things. And, that can be as simple as like sleep more, drink a ton of water, take some, fiber, and stop eating sugar and drink some bone broth, and maybe meditate if you can throw it in. Let's see how you feel in 4 weeks. And that person's probably going to have a pretty big shift if they weren't that far off in the first place. But I find that really complex cases are the ones that are trickier, because, yeah, you just have to listen to that person's system and see what it's okay with. And they're the ones I check in with more often. So it's like if we make a suggestion, I like to know how they're doing within like a week, because sometimes we have to back off on that suggestion, or sometimes they only need it for a couple days and then we take a break. And when it comes to detox and binding and all of that, if I'm ever like helping someone detox their gut, because I know like the big parasite cleanses are really kind of a fad right now. And like we all live with parasites. We all have parasites. They've been a part of our ecosystem for eons. And it's just about if your system is overwhelmed by it or not. But I don't think that doing a huge parasite detox and detox push, if your gut is super messed up, is necessarily the right move. Like you might need to support the gut first and get it ready, and then you can do those things, because otherwise it can be a very unpleasant process.
Yeah. Wow. I'm so grateful for all this wisdom that you're sharing. And I just wish that, everybody had access to practitioners like yourself when they're going through the healing process. And we're coming to the end of this interview. I really just feel like there's so much to talk about in regards to gut. There's so much to talk about in regards to stress, anxiety, and different ways that we can help the body heal. So I feel like you did such a great job in giving like an overall explanation of what we can do. And like you said, it's all individual and it's no one size fits all. It's really beautiful how you give people the permission to be able to talk about their history and what's really coming up for them. So we're just coming to the end of this interview, and I just wanted to make sure that people can access your work. So if you wanted to maybe just explain on to the audience on how we can get more familiar with your work and delve deeper into the research that you have done on all of these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website I kind of use it as a home base for everything. You can find pretty much whatever you want there. It's just depth, like you have depth, DEPTH, wellness.com. And there's a bunch of speaking on there. There's a bunch of free summits and webinars on there. And I'm always, I love collaborating with other practitioners and just helping people find knowledge, because that's the question I get the most, in person and on social media, is like, how do I find this stuff? And to me, I'm surrounded by it all the time. And so I just want to make it available to people. And I'm hoping in next year, I kind of want to start like a little, like a membership page where people can come hang out, because people graduate from care and they still want to hang out, but they don't necessarily need treatment anymore, but they want to be able to participate and have a community. And so I'm working on developing that. And I have a Facebook page that's called Wellness Evolution Community that people can join too. And on there, I try to put posts, and I try to put the social media things I put up, or interviews or resources or PDFs or just different tools and access to different people. Like, if people want to work with me, fantastic. But if I'm not the right fit, I want to help you find the right person. So that's really what that's for. It's just a place for people to find what they really need and who they resonate with, because I think that's the most important part of care, is just finding someone that, really speaks to you and that you feel really comfortable with. But otherwise, I provide tons of free education on social media as well. And I have a YouTube that's also just Depth Wellness. And on Instagram, it's just Dr. Christine Smith, all one word. And I'm always putting up little tidbits on Instagram, just like daily reels and stuff, but those are short. And then if people want to do a deeper dive or anything, I love your guys' course, and I think it's an invaluable asset for people to check out. And so anyone who's wanting to learn more about nutrition, the Food Matters Institute has some wonderful courses. And then I also have just like an online course I developed that takes people through basically 5 weeks of transforming their mind and transforming their body without necessarily being stuck to a giant set of rules. It's like I wanted it to feel sustainable, because I know when I was going through my own healing, I went through the tricky spot of not really being able to eat anything because I'd had a mold exposure and my system was just overwhelmed, and I'd had an injury. It was like, the trio cascade of just all of it at once. And all these practitioners were telling me to just like stop eating everything, and that's impossible. So I had to figure out in my own system like how to listen to it. I was like, okay, like I can't have this every day, but I can have it every 4 days. And I start learning how to track what was happening in my body. So that's really what I teach people to do in that program. And it has meditations every week as well. So anyone where like mindfulness is a new thing to them, I teach them how to do that and introduce them to it and kind of guide them through. And sometimes I'll do it as a group program. I'm going to do another one in February, which should be fun. It's like a way to help people continue with their New Year's resolutions when we all start to kind of drop off at the end of January. And that one's fun. I do it as like a self-love course, and they're all different when I do the group courses, because we watch the same material and then we come together and we talk for like an hour or two as a group about, what's going on and just answering people's questions. And clients learn more from each other in those group sessions sometimes than from me. And I'm just kind of facilitating everything. And whatever question you have, someone else has that question. Like there are no stupid questions. And it's really nice to do it in community, because I think our healthcare system, even though it's well-intentioned to keep our information private, it's incredibly lonely. And so it's really nice to find group programs like that. And then, in that course, I also bring on professional chefs and a professional meditation coach. And we talk about, different concepts and tricks for cooking with food sensitivities. Because once you figure out how to make something without all the stuff that you can't have, you often find a way to make it better. It's just the creativity of getting there and learning how to do that. So that's kind of what that course is for. I call it Reclaim Vitality. And that's on my website under the online courses tab, so people can check that out. But wherever you're at, I want there to be something for you, right? Like there's free education. I also have like little webinars that people can do that are more advanced. They're like an hour and a half, but I have one on, lab basics and like understanding your lab results and understanding what you can ask for and what exists in functional lab testing and when I look for what and why and how your organs are distributed and what role they have. Like I actually consider your lungs a part of the immune system. And people forget that because there's a whole bunch of mast cells in there. And if you're breathing in a bunch of toxins, your immune system gets activated. So lots of resources for you.
Okay, I love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Christine. I love your wisdom and that you have actually been able to put together all these resources that people can access, especially nowadays, when we have access to so much overwhelming amount of information. Where do we go? And you're obviously able to funnel all of that and put it together in nice courses and programs and online videos. So thank you so much again. Thank you so much for this interview. And we just love spending time with you. So hopefully we can meet you in person one day.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So yes, thank you everyone for listening. I really enjoyed that talk. I hope you did too. And there will be more of these on the Food Matters podcast. So head to foodmatters.com and see you again.